Take a look at the city of Ismailia inside Egypt, located right on the Suez Canal. This is a location where an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood first originated in 1928. It was founded by a teacher named Hassan al-Banna as a response to the poverty seen in Arab countries during the early 20th century. They denounced Western values like secularism and preached a return to traditional Islamic principles. The Brotherhood advocates to establish a government that would implement Islamic Sharia law. They established a network of schools, hospitals, businesses, and mosques throughout the 1940s with the goal of alleviating people's poor living conditions that they blamed on British colonialism. So, how did this Egyptian organization, over 100 miles away from Palestine, eventually split into an armed faction known as Hamas? And how did that group eventually come to rule the Gaza Strip? During the 1940s, the Muslim Brotherhood expanded across Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, bordering Israel and Gaza. The Brotherhood opposed the UN's partition of Palestine, so when the Arab-Israeli War broke out in 1948, 10,000 of their members volunteered to fight against Israel. In the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli War, throughout the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood continued their resistance against Israel through various means, including labor strikes, protests, and diplomatic lobbying efforts. Between 1959 and 1967, Egypt then occupied and controlled Gaza, which made it easier for the Egyptian-based Brotherhood to set up roots and create lasting ties there. In 1967, the Israeli and Egyptian military fought another war, and as a result, Israel occupied Palestine's Gaza and the West Bank. This increased tensions between Israel and the people living in Gaza. Then, in 1967, a Palestinian cleric named Sheikh Ahmed Yassin helped establish an Islamic charity organization called Mujama al-Islamiya as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. This group is often cited as the precursor to Hamas. But where did the founder, Yassin, come from? He was a refugee of the Arab-Israeli War. When he was about 12, he had a sporting accident that left him wheelchair-bound. And so he decided to devote his life to Islamic scholarship and studied at a university in Cairo, Egypt. Yassin's charity organization officially registered with the Israeli government in 1978 as a non-profit, non-government organization. According to this congressional research report, the Israeli government approved licenses for the Mujama charity to operate as a provider of social services, establish schools, and build mosques. For example, under this authorization, they built the Islamic University in Gaza. While Israel ruled Gaza during the 1970s, they loosened previous restrictions on Islamic organizations. They aimed to allow peaceful religious organizations to grow. This change in policy allowed the Mujama organization to be able to build goodwill and develop a network of local institutions aimed at helping the people of Gaza. Originally, Mujama was best known for building medical centers and offering welfare services. The Israeli government showed indifference to this organization throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, at a time when Israel occupied and ran Gaza. With the benefit of hindsight, we know Mujama eventually becomes Hamas, but at the time, it was just a peaceful religious charity. It's possible Israel was hoping to promote a more moderate, non-violent counterbalance to the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization, because the PLO were locked in a violent armed resistance against Israel at the time. But when did Mujama split into Hamas? There was some evidence to suggest that Mujama charity had started to get involved in armed resistance by 1984, because that's the year when Israeli soldiers raided one of their mosques and claimed to have found a cache of weapons. The leader of the group, Sheikh Yassin, was arrested for stockpiling these arms and munitions. By the late 1980s, the Mujama charity controlled 40% of the mosques in Gaza. Officially, all signs appeared to show that the Mujama charity was still a peaceful group. But that would soon change. With Palestinian territories split between the Gaza Strip and West Bank, unrest and growing resentment over Israeli occupation broke out 2 years later in 1987, during a massive wave of riots and protests called the First Intifada, which means uprising. On December 10, 1987, an Israeli army truck crashed into a car at a Gaza checkpoint, killing 4 Palestinian workers. This is often cited as the catalyst that sparked protests and riots of the First Intifada. It was a full-on revolt against the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. According to this paper written in 1993, For the Journal of Palestinian Studies, 6 members of the Muslim Brotherhood met at Sheikh Yassin's house and wanted to join the reaction. But the Muslim Brotherhood and the Mujama charity had chosen to not violently resist Israel. This is when they're said to have co-founded the Islamic resistance movement as an offshoot from Yassin's Mujama charity. This move was potentially a step taken as a way to separate their actions from other organizations. The acronym for the group that they created in Arabic was HAMAS, which also meant zeal or intense enthusiasm, passion, or fervor for a cause. Although the name wouldn't officially be used until January 1988, when they published their charter outlining their reason for existing. They called for an armed resistance to establish a Palestinian state and the destruction of Israel. Hamas envisioned a Palestinian state that would cover all the territory that had previously belonged to the British Mandate for Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. In 1989, the Israeli government arrested Sheikh Yassin and sentenced him to life in prison for allegedly ordering the killing of Palestinians who had collaborated to help the Israeli army. In the summer of 1991, for the first time, they organized into armed militia units called the Al-Qassam Brigades. Hamas condemned the 1993 Oslo Accords. This Oslo Accords agreement between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel created what's called the Palestinian Authority, that was intended to be an interim self-governing body with the main responsibility of managing certain aspects of civil governance inside parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The expectation was that the Palestinian Authority would eventually be replaced by a democratically elected government by the Palestinian people. The idea was that it would help Palestinians reach self-determination for their government. From these accords, the PLO officially dropped their official stance of armed resistance against Israel. However, this is where Hamas would pick up and carry that torch going forward. Hamas believed the PLO had signed away the rights of the Palestinian people by agreeing to work with Israel. An engineering graduate named Yahya Ayash joined Hamas and put his engineering skills to work for the group building bombs. Nicknamed the Engineer, Hamas first used these bombs in kamikaze attacks starting in April 1993. In response, the United States government designated Hamas as a terror organization in 1997. That same year, the group's founder, Yassin, was released in another prisoner exchange. By now, in some circles, his popularity and prominence had grown to rival Yasser Arafat. He was seen by some as a symbol of terrorism and by others as a symbol of resistance. And this is when Iran first took note of that. They started to fund Hamas and supply them with weapons. As early as 1990, Iran hosted Hamas leadership at conferences in Tehran. A senior leader in Hamas named Musha Abu Marzouk met with Iran's leader Ayatollah Khomeini in the early 1990s. Iran pledged military and financial support, including $30 million annually to Hamas. They granted advanced military training for thousands of Hamas militia at their Revolutionary Guard bases located inside Iran and Lebanon. Hamas opened an office inside Iran. Iran was interested in promoting a more hardline alternative to the PLO, who was engaged with peace talks with Israel. What this shows is Hamas taking its first steps as an organization towards taking on a diplomatic and foreign affairs presence. But how did this armed militia group become a political organization that would run Gaza? But first, I want to highlight the importance of preparedness in these uncertain times. Our sponsor, Parcel Safety, offers products that are essential for any emergency kit: the NB100 tactical gas mask and the ST100X respirator. Since 2016, we've all ridden the waves of civil unrest, wildfires, and escalating global conflicts. It's clear that ensuring the safety of ourselves and our loved ones means being ready for anything. The NB100 tactical gas mask isn't just any gas mask. Designed with a robust, tactical approach, it's built to endure the most challenging conditions. It's a highly efficient filter that captures a broad spectrum of toxic gases, vapors, and particulates. Its 200-degree panoramic field of view and anti-fog feature ensures your situational awareness remains unimpeded. Remember, the best time to prepare was yesterday, and the next best time is now. Head over to the link in the description and use the exclusive code TASK&PURPOSE at checkout to receive 25% off your purchase. Stay vigilant in a world where being prepared means staying ahead. In fact, as early as 1995, several known Hamas members had declared their intentions to run as independents in the 1995 Palestinian elections. But the Hamas leadership didn't want to legitimize the secular Palestinian Authority by participating in those national elections. Hamas pressured those members to withdraw from the elections, and instead, they chose to participate in local elections for municipal government positions in what you might call a grassroots effort. Between 1993 and the year 2000, the majority of international aid was sent through the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, which was run by President Arafat. Since 1994, the United States alone has provided over $5.2 billion in aid to Palestine, but the Palestinian Authority was starting to gain a reputation for corruption. Its leader, Yasser Arafat, would allegedly keep a portion of that money for himself. This CBS News article reports that Arafat diverted $1 billion in funds for his political campaign, with far more money unaccounted for. Hamas saw a chance here to gain public support by distributing 95% of their funds directly to the Palestinian people who were in the greatest need. This resulted in them gaining a reputation among the people as fair. This tactic is commonly used by cartels, criminal organizations, and terrorist groups to gain public support. We start to see how Hamas was setting the groundwork to argue that they were a legitimate political alternative to Arafat and the PLO. But Hamas still wasn't strong enough to take on the PLO head-on. Something else would need to happen first to make the conditions and factors more favorable for them. This event was about to happen because during the late 1990s, Palestinian groups accused Israel of not upholding their end of the bargain from the Oslo Accords. This disagreement led to another uprising in September 2000 called the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was way bigger than the first. Hamas and groups like Fatah, who were part of the Palestinian Authority, joined forces together against Israel. In response, the IDF mounted Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. It was a months-long operation that did succeed in reducing violence in Israeli cities by 70%. This military operation eliminated so much of the secular Palestinian Authority inside Gaza that it created a power vacuum. The political vacuum and the mounting toll on Palestinian civilians empowered Hamas. So why did Hamas survive the conflict better? They dug a network of tunnels to funnel supplies into Gaza and avoid Israeli airstrikes. Hamas knew the IDF tactics that were great at finding and eliminating their mid-level leaders, so they created a strategy of giving multiple militant cells the same target to ensure redundancy. To try to counter this, Israel focused on targeting Hamas leadership instead of just mid-level operatives. In July 2002, Israel killed the leader of Hamas' militant wing with an F-16 airstrike. Then, an Israeli gunship killed Hamas' spiritual leader and founder, Ahmed Yassin, on March 22, 2004. In response to the loss of their founder, Hamas attacks escalated even further. The IDF then launched raids inside Gaza. At last, Israel, Fatah, and Hamas made progress in peace talks when Israel committed to withdrawing all their military presence in the Gaza Strip. Israel's withdrawal was complete by August 2005, and historians consider this move to be one of the major factors that ended the Second Intifada. The Palestinian Authority was always meant to be an interim government that would eventually be replaced by one elected by the Palestinian people. Mahmoud Abbas won the election to succeed Arafat as president of the Palestinian Authority. In June 2002, US President George Bush made a White House speech calling for the Palestinians to elect a new leader and build a practicing democracy. The US government even spent $1.9 million to aid Fatah to win the elections, so they were confident that the results wouldn't go in the favor of Hamas. The world was about to be shocked. In the book, The Contested Road to Statehood, Martin Keir makes the argument that the leaders of Hamas saw an opportunity to translate whatever popular support that they had gained through armed resistance and social services into political legitimacy and institutional power. According to Keir, the idea that a militant movement like Hamas would possess both military and political organizations isn't anything new. The Lebanese Hezbollah and the IRA Sinn Féin groups are two examples that are frequently cited. At this point, Hamas was ready to enter the political realm. By 2006, Fatah's power was waning through a combination of Yasser Arafat's death, the losses that they'd suffered in the Second Intifada, and claims of widespread corruption. Due in part to these factors, in 2006, the Palestinian elections stunned the entire world when Hamas won a majority of the seats in a general election in Gaza. Hamas member Ismail Haniyeh became the prime minister of Gaza, and what follows is a period of absolute chaos. This election broke the political unity between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The election results divided Palestinians between Fatah and the more militant Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. The Palestinian electoral system is complicated, but international observers did certify the election was an honest one, and Hamas had legitimately claimed victory. Though it should be noted, only a third of Gaza's population cast their vote on election day. And even though Fatah candidates had won a majority of the vote, they lost seats because they were unable to agree on a single candidate, and so they essentially split their own vote. Israel and Egypt revoked thousands of work permits for Gaza citizens and imposed a blockade, because from their perspective, there was now a violent extremist organization on their border. Unemployment in Gaza rose from 26% in 2004 to 50%. Hamas civil administration fired much of the police force and cracked down on local gangs and criminals to restore order in Gaza Strip. The US government approved the Israeli government's decision to cut off Palestine's tax revenues from their imports and exports, which Israel collected on Palestine's behalf. If the goal was to bankrupt the Hamas organization and Gaza, it was working. However, in December 2006, the Hamas prime minister visited Iran and secured a pledge of $250 million in aid and additional military training. This deal saved Hamas from financial ruin and allowed them to continue to pay their security forces. Meanwhile, the financial sanctions against Palestine destroyed the more secular Fatah's ability to pay their own security forces, which weakened them further. Because by November 2006, Hamas and Fatah were engaged in armed conflict, a full-on civil war for control of Gaza. The Bush administration in the United States tried to approve $86.4 million in lethal aid specifically for Fatah's security forces to fight and win against Hamas, but Congress denied the request over concerns that the money could eventually fund terror groups in Palestine. By 2007, Hamas had won the civil war and gained full control of Gaza. If the goal was to bankrupt Gaza and Hamas, to influence the Palestinian people into demanding a new election to throw out Hamas, then the plan had backfired. Israel and Hamas were at an impasse. Israel would tighten their blockade more than ever before, and Hamas would increase rocket attacks. Until 2017, when Hamas changed their official charter from the original one that called for the destruction of Israel. The new charter was generally seen as more moderate than the organization's previous one. It expressed a willingness to accept a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, which would be seen as a concession from their point. One of the main points of negotiation between Israel and Hamas had been work visas that would allow Gaza workers to earn more money inside Israel. Starting in 2019, Israel began to allow a lot more work visas for Gaza residents so they could earn more money. However, not everyone agreed with this strategy. It's interesting to me that there's articles with the title, "Israel Secretly Propped Up Hamas." But when you read the actual article, the authors themselves don't even make that claim. When you read the article, their argument is that Netanyahu gave money to Gaza in exchange for peace. But very few people are going to read that. The majority of people are only going to see the headline. The Times of Israel, Tal Schneider, wrote an opinion piece titled, "For years Netanyahu propped up Hamas, now it's blown up in our faces." In the article, Tal made the argument that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu sent funding and support to Hamas by allowing these increased work visas. She argued that this kept money flowing into Gaza and by extension to Hamas. Tal states, quote, "Since Netanyahu returned to power in January 2023, the number of work permits for Gaza residents has soared to nearly 20,000. Tal believed that Israel bought peace with Hamas by allowing Gaza's workers to earn higher salaries, which were then given to Hamas for them to grow stronger. Israel and Hamas also negotiated an unofficial peace agreement with Egypt that would allow Qatar to send millions of dollars in aid to Gaza. According to Tal Schneider's interpretation, Netanyahu supported Hamas with millions of dollars to maintain a fragile peace." Netanyahu said this was ridiculous and pointed out he had led 3 military campaigns to weaken Hamas. He hoped that by allowing money to enter Gaza, he would help create peace and reduce rocket attacks on Israeli civilians. In exchange, the Hamas militants then used their forces to prevent further protests. Israel often exchanged money with Hamas in order to reach a peace agreement through Egypt. All attempts at peace between Hamas and Israel have failed since 2006, and the two have fought in many separate wars. The negotiations for increased work permits were unsuccessful in securing lasting peace. On October 7th, Hamas was responsible for carrying out terror attacks inside Israel that left over 1,200 dead, and the two sides have been locked in battle since. The rise of Hamas is a complicated and controversial story that spans all the way back to the 1920s. I did my best to present the facts for you to give you the most possible context surrounding this story. For further updates, follow me on Instagram @CappyArmy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again in a few days.